It's a pleasure to be before you as one of the majority makers. And as a mom, and as a business owner, and as a mayor, these issues matter. They matter to Oregonians, and they matter to Americans. Due to the poor energy policies, we've gone from energy independent to energy dependent. And that's what we want to avoid. And in order to do that, we have to have a plan. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is intended for emergencies. Nearly 40% of the stockpile is now gone, the lowest level we've seen in 40 years. It was the largest drawdown in U.S. history. It's clear that Congress needs to act. The people who elected us expect us to have a plan. That's what mayors do. That's what congressional leaders do. Failing to do so leaves us vulnerable. Natural disasters and national emergencies in the future. We have to be prepared. The Strategic Production Response Act requires us a plan that Oregonians asked us to pay attention to, that Americans asked us to pay attention to. Domestic energy production, if the SPR is tapped, for those non-emergency purposes. I'm very proud as a freshman legislator to co-sponsor this bill. It's an important step forward in restoring our energy security. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Tom Emmer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
There you go. Thank you for being here toward the end of the day. I just have one question for Mr. Bolin. In regards to the view of the National Business Aviation Association, what is the view of the NBA's view of FAA's safety management system in regard to the proposed rulemaking?
Well, thank you very much. As I indicated earlier, SMS is a powerful tool, and I think we all recognize the benefits that it has, and we want it to be something that works at scale for everyone. I think that what we see with the new SMS rule, and it just came out recently, they've extended the comment period for 90 days, and we're going through it very carefully to make sure it actually is a tool that can be useful and not an impediment. So we are right now looking at the SMS tools that we have used, including ISBEO, something that was developed by the business aviation community, looking at the scalability, and we look to provide robust comments to that. We're in an education phase, and we know that it is imperative that we get an SMS tool, but that it is done at the right scale. And so that's really what we're focusing on.
Well, I appreciate that. As I was reading kind of through the testimony, Mr. Ambrosi, I think, referenced it, and to scale is difficult sometimes with the collaboration of 121 airlines, and when you're trying to factor in, labor, organization, regulation, manufacturing, I can see that it takes time, and so I appreciate that comment on the rulemaking, and I just wanted to ask that question and how you all were feeling in referencing those rules. So thank you for that answer. I don't know if you have any additional details on that, but if not, I thank you for your answer, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Ezell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman, I rise today as a proud mother of twin daughters. As a parent, I know moms and dads agree that we all want what's best for our children. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult for us to let our sons and daughters go on their first day of kindergarten. We have to start placing an enormous amount of trust in our teachers and administrators to do what's best for our children. But at the end of the day, nobody will understand a child's interests and needs more than the people who love them most, their parents. So it's easy to understand why parents want to have and deserve to have the right to know what's going on inside the classroom. It is their responsibility. That's why we need the Parents' Bill of Rights, to help students succeed by ensuring every parent can have a voice in their child's education. During the committee markup on this bill, I was honored to lead 2 proposals that are now included. One will help parents better understand the priorities of their children's school by bringing much-needed clarity to school budgets. The other sets both parents and teachers up for success by simplifying the curriculum feedback process. My proposals build on 2 of the 5 core principles of the Parents' Bill of Rights. Parents have the right to know what their children are being taught, and parents have the right to see the school's budget and spending. I will always fight to protect parental involvement and to put parents first. I'm proud to support the Parents' Bill of Rights. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Ms. Trump, it seems there's biased administrators are empowered by their school's ability to define harassment, past what Title IX provides, resulting in weaponized and fluid definitions of serious terms. Would it be responsible for Congress to provide schools with clarity on what is and what is not harassment?
Yes, currently there's something called the Davis Standard in place on Title IX, and this is something that through our lawsuits we've also had universities implement in their other harassment and anti-discrimination policies. This Davis Standard has a very high bar for what kind of speech can be considered harassing conduct. And because of that, it balances, it's the best example we've seen to date that balances First Amendment rights and protections with protecting students through these policies. And that Davis Standard says that in order for speech to be considered harassing conduct, it has to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that to the point where students don't have equal access to education. And that is the best example we've seen, and it would be great if Congress was interested in codifying something like that.
Well, that kind of answers my next question, so I'll go ahead and leave that at that. Ms. Nozzle, I think it's important to remember that my Democratic colleagues also value the First Amendment. As the Democrat witness, who is fully invested in protecting free speech on college campuses, in which specific areas should Democrats and Republicans on this committee work together to address this specific issue?
I think shining a spotlight on those shared concerns, reinforcing those shared concerns, and the basic precepts of the First Amendment. I think the kinds of legislation that we've seen, Mr. Shapiro just said he'd be hesitant to see legislation trying to dictate who could and can't be hired on college campus. And I wonder why that same concern is not raised in relation to what can and can't be taught on a college campus, or whether a college campus can have something called a DEI office that may deal with things like veterans affairs and disability rights issues, along with other topics. So I think reinforcing that basic precept of the First Amendment that says, this is not the realm of legislation, that academic freedom on campus needs to be protected, that we need a buffer zone so that it's not direct intervention and political dictates saying what can and cannot be taught. I think that's a place where I would hope we can come together.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes. I'm sorry. You want to be last. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. The widespread anti-Semitism we're seeing on college campuses is one of the most important issues in higher education. Since the horrific terror attacks of October 7th, Jewish students have found themselves constantly under attack for simply being Jewish. Dr. Shafiq, Columbia has been one of the worst offenders. I place that responsibility of campus safety right at the feet of university presidents, and in this case, it's you. Jewish students fear for their lives at your university. They have been harassed, threatened, and assaulted by fellow classmates. But it's no wonder students think this is okay. They're learning in class how to target Jews. At our hearing with the presidents of MIT, Harvard, and UPenn, I highlighted the astonishingly low number of courses being offered on Jewish history. Dr. Shafiq, I also looked into your university's course offerings for this semester. You only have 3 classes that teach the history of Israel. 2 of them are taught by Israelis and Jews, but those 2 classes combined only have 30 seats. But the 3rd class can have up to 60 students, and that class, of course, is taught by Joseph Mossad, someone this committee is all too familiar with. Joseph Mossad has been surrounded by controversy for his anti-Semitic rhetoric since the early 2000s. He praised the brutal attack, as we've heard today, of Hamas on October 7th as awesome, astonishing, and astounding. He called the videos that showed murder and rape of Israeli women stunning. Dr. Shafiq, I've been to the towns attacked by Hamas. Let me tell you, there is nothing awesome or astounding about the rape and murder of thousands of innocent civilians. Dr. Shafiq, Joseph Mossad has been a problem for more than 20 years. Why haven't you shown that anti-Semitism is not tolerated at your university by firing him? I know you've commented already on that today. Does Columbia support this type of speech?
No, and as I said, he is under investigation. But I also, if I may, speak to your question about our course offerings. Before this hearing, the two directors of our Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies came to see me, and they said to me, make sure the committee knows that Columbia is not a hotbed of anti-Semitism, but that we are a pioneer in Jewish studies.
But two classes is not going to prolifically tell that to the world, and that's what the story that needs to be told. And excuse me, Dr. Mossad is a tenured professor, but that doesn't mean he can't be fired, correct? Can he be fired?
There are some very complex issues around tenure.
So at Columbia University, quote, an appointment with tenure may be terminated for cause only when a faculty member is found to be professionally unfit, as demonstrated, for example, by gross inefficiency, habitual and intentional neglect of duty, other serious breaches of academic conduct, or serious personal misconduct. Dr. Shafiq, you told Congressman Wahlberg earlier today that if given the opportunity to grant Dr. Mossad a tenured position today, you would not. In your opinion, has his anti-Semitic conduct risen to being professionally unfit, or a serious breach of academic conduct, or serious professional misconduct?
As I said, he is being investigated.
So he can be fired according to this quote?
According to our rules, there are certain conditions under which tenured faculty
Okay, moving on. As I said back in December, the most powerful mover of campus culture is education itself. And you said that today. We can stop this if we educate the future about Israel. And again, those classes do not prove that you're taking action with what you said. But Columbia has shown through its choices on faculty and, of course, offerings that you don't care about anti-Semitism, that you'll turn a blind eye to the attacks on the most persecuted people of the last 5,000 years. That's why you've let Joseph Mossad teach at a class bigger than all the other Israeli history classes combined. That's why you continue to allow your Jewish students to be harassed, threatened, and assaulted on your campus. And Dr. Shafiq, you said earlier today that the best way to combat anti-Semitism is through that education. So I'm going to say it once again. So since there are only 3 undergrad courses Columbia offers on Jewish and Israeli history, will you commit to pushing your deans to add more courses on Jewish history and remove those who teach and praise anti-Semitic violence like Joseph Mossad?
Our Institute for Israeli and Jewish Studies offers 21 courses. We have a collaborative arrangement with the Jewish Theological Seminary, and many of the students who are doing the joint degree with the Jewish Theological Seminary are here.
It's
so
time your Jewish students finally see that you actually care about their safety. Teach these classes and fire the racists. It's a pretty low bar. We'll be watching to see if you do that. And Madam Chair, I yield back my time.
Ms. Stevens, Ms. Chavez-DeRemer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Cardona, it's been a busy time for you, and in this time in history, not for very good reasons. This committee is unsettled by the failures of both you and your staff in handling the FAFSA debacle and rising anti-Semitism on college campuses. But I want to start with the FAFSA. Over the past months, my district has been handling a high number of cases for parents seeking help with the FAFSA and how to deal with your department. They can't get a real person on the phone. They spend hours on hold and eventually are told their issues are technical glitches with zero guidance on what the next steps might be. All the while, their kids missed early acceptance deadlines because they didn't know how much financial aid they were going to be working with. That part really frustrates me. Actually, when I think about, do I get mad about certain things? Those are the kind of things of unresponsiveness. And it's been 100% to my Office of Non-Responsiveness, not even a confirmation of receiving the case when we submit one. And I pride myself on casework. The congressional phone line for the department sometimes allows the team to leave a message, but no one ever calls us back. So I've been frustrated. Other agencies at least respond, that they'll get back to me with an answer. And so I asked myself, who did you hire? Because it seems unacceptable. And really, quite frankly, I've hired and fired throughout my career people, and it seems pathetic to not be able to at least hire people who can return a message. The Department of Education, if it exists for a real purpose, it's to increase access to education. And you and your staff seem to have failed spectacularly, unfortunately, in the casework in clearing that bar. Let me talk now about another low bar the department seems to be struggling with. After October 7th, anti-Semites on college campuses came out in droves. Jewish students have openly stated that they feel threatened and unsafe, and some have been physically assaulted. About a week ago, one rabbi affiliated with Columbia University advised Jewish students to leave campus for Passover. Schools have canceled their commencement ceremonies, and last week, GW University's law school here in D.C. relocated its final exams to an undisclosed and secure location. Our schools in Oregon are dealing with similar situations, and I've talked to those university presidents and what the future could look like. It really is the greatest crisis in American education in decades. Last week, before a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, you mentioned the department's Office of Civil Rights roughly had 145 investigations into the universities and schools and the school districts for potential Title VI violations. This, of course, is the legal basis for investigations and actions regarding discrimination based on race or religion. In this case, countless Jewish students. You somewhat touched on it today, but what is the timeline for the resolution of these investigations, and when will penalties, if appropriate, be announced and imposed? And I really would hope that you don't answer, if you give us more money, you'll have those answers.
Thank you for the questions. I agree with you that hate has no place on our campuses and we must act. I just want to go back and say this is the administration that reopened schools, provided debt relief, and overhauled a 40-year-old FAFSA system. And while delayed, we are working 24/7 to serve the people that you represent. And I'm committed to making sure you have information. I'll ask someone from my team to reach out to you this week on your questions. With regard to the anti-Semitism, it's unacceptable. And we take a very strong stance on that. We have more cases open. We've closed more cases than the last administration already. We're committed to it. We have guidance within 2 clicks of our website that provides a Dear Colleague letter that was sent out today, a letter that I sent out Friday. This is something we take very seriously as well.
Thank you. And so the reason these investigations are important to get through is because it really doesn't seem to protect students when they need it most, and that's immediately. On December 6th, you received a letter from the leaders of the Jewish Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. They asked you to issue that guidance. And I was glad to see this morning that you issued that new guidance for the administrators from pre-K to post-grad to fulfill those Title VI obligations. Mr. Secretary, exactly how many forms of guidance have you now circulated since October 7th? We've had over 100 actions. And I can tell you with the guidance, I have to say at least 3 or 4 that I can think of off the top of my head. There could be more. Visit ed.gov, click on supporting campus safety. Thank you. And there's a whole list there for yourself and your constituents. Thank you. It also says schools have a legal responsibility to address the discrimination against those students. And it sounds like that you would include when protesters shout from the river to the sea at Jewish students. And yet, out of roughly 10 reference examples this new guidance provides, the chant is never mentioned. So 2 final questions before my time is up. Does the department recognize that screaming from the river to the sea at Jewish students is a call for genocide? And 2, if schools do not follow this guidance, will you impose penalties such as withholding funding, as you committed to Congresswoman Manning that you will do that? Calls for genocide are abhorrent, and we stand against those. And if brought forward, will you withhold funding, as you committed to Congresswoman Manning? If schools refuse to adhere to Title VI, absolutely. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Smucker, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. Oregon teenagers are dying from drug overdoses at a faster rate than any other state. In fact, adolescent overdose deaths overdose deaths have more than tripled in Oregon since 2019. It's because dangerous amounts of fentanyl and fentanyl-laced pills are flooding our streets. Last year in my district, law enforcement seized enough fentanyl powder to kill the entire population of Oregon in just one single drug bust. I believe we must take a 2-pronged approach to tackling the fentanyl crisis: support law enforcement and enact tough-on-crime policies. That's why I'm proud to co-sponsor the HALT Fentanyl Act, which accomplishes both of these goals by permanently classifying fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs. I urge my colleagues to support this life-saving legislation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Becerra, thank you for coming today. As some of my colleagues have mentioned, your impatience to place undocumented children with sponsors at a faster rate than your caseworkers could handle placed thousands of kids in dangerous conditions where they were exploited for labor. Kids as young as 12, some even died. This is a chilling failure of leadership, but the President has decided to keep you on board, as we have an obligation to the American people to work together. So let's make sure this never happens again. Yes or no, do you commit yourself and your staff to working with me and committee staff on this issue that includes providing us materials which can educate us as to how the sponsorship process has been abused?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question, and we have been working directly with the committee and members on this committee in the past. We look forward to working with you to make sure that we are doing everything possible to protect the children who are in our care.
Have you reviewed how to improve the vetting process for sponsors since the New York Times story, and what improvements have you made to date?
Congresswoman, we've been reviewing the vetting process since I became secretary, because it's an ongoing process. The circumstances have changed, as you would know, very dramatically. In 2021, there were large numbers of children in our care. Today, the number is greatly smaller. And so what we're trying to do is constantly be on top of what it takes to make sure that we care for the kids who are in our temporary custody well, but we also make the right placements once they are able to go out into the community.
Okay, so with that being said, you've concluded which areas do you think Congress needs to address? And aside from comprehensive immigration reform, which we're already doing that with the Dignity Act, well, tell me, where can Congress help you?
I appreciate the question. And there's a very simple answer to that, because many of the questions many of your colleagues have asked are, why are we not accounting for children? I keep trying to explain that we only have jurisdiction based on what Congress has given us. Someone has to be able to account for these kids in a better way, these migrant children who are ending up working in these exploitive conditions. We don't have the authority to check up on them, to follow up and require them to check in with us, as a foster care program might have with a U.S. citizen child. If you want to help us, make sure that someone in the federal government, maybe it's not HHS, maybe you decide it's the Department of Labor, maybe you decide it's done through the states, but there's a gap. When we have the kids in our custody, they're not exploited in a labor workplace. Once we place them with a parent or a close relative, we don't have jurisdiction. Who will make sure that they're accounted for or taken care of? There's the gap. And I would hope that rather than make accusations, members would try to work with us to make sure that if they really care about kids, we are making sure that they're accounted for. Who has jurisdiction?
So let me add on to that. Talk to me a little bit about the child labor space. Within your department's jurisdiction, what areas would you be willing to partner with me and the committee to strengthen those guardrails needed to protect these kids?
We can work with you right now we're working with the Department of Labor. They're trying to give us any signals if there's some signs that a particular person who might want to sponsor a child, or in particular areas of the country, we see that type of exploitive behavior. If we get that information early, we can have then the red flag go off if someone is seeking to sponsor a child who fits that profile or lives in that area. We can work with you if it happens to be in your congressional district, or if you're interested in helping us merge and better tie the work that the different agencies can do. And then where you really can help us, get the local agencies, the state and local agencies, the licensing care facilities at the state level, the community organizations that work with families, migrant kids, to work closely with you and with us to make sure that we're all trying to do this seamlessly, so there is no gap in who's accounting for these children.
Thank you. I think there's little words that can describe the anger that we all felt when we read the New York Times story and when it broke. We do feel like there was a betrayal of trust for our most vulnerable kids in this country. And you know, they're surrounded by those strange faces. And I just can't imagine that for my own kids or anybody else's kids. So I do expect that I will work with you, but I do expect that you'll honor those commitments that you've made to me today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. So far, we've heard a lot about pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs. And so for just a quick refresher, while we've asked several questions over and over again, I think it's fair to the American people to hear it over and over again what your answers are. So PBMs decide which medications are covered by health insurance plans, which pharmacies patients can use, and all are owned by insurance companies who in turn also own the pharmacies. And the discounts acquired by PBMs, known as rebates, are often not passed down to the patients. In other words, a PBM could get a $100 rebate from a pharmaceutical company, pass along the $15 to a patient, and pocket the remaining $85. Meaning the insurance company is forcing a larger copay on a patient so that they can pay themselves more than if there was no rebate at all. It's really a system beating down on the patients, and that's who we hear from. So, Mr. Baker, how could we require PBMs to pass through the discounts from rebates onto the patients and avoid insurance companies jacking up the premiums because they're losing profits from these rebates?
That's a great question, and I think it goes back to the theme of the conversation here today, transparency and data. To make sure that at that claim level, the ultimate plan sponsor can see exactly what is being charged, what they're getting back in rebate dollars from the pharmaceutical manufacturers in aggregate. But I think you also bring up another very important point about the PBMs owning their own pharmacies and having that control. Just for perspective, a drug cost is not a drug cost, and this is where we've got to look at that, major corporate umbrella that these PBMs are part of. For example, Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drug Company, there's a drug called imatinib. You can buy it from him for a year's supply for $866. There's one PBM that works with 4 large state health plans. If you are part of the state health plan of Kentucky, that drug's going to cost you $26,000. If you're part of Louisiana's health plan, it's $57,000. If you're part of Georgia's health plan, it's $170,000. And if you're unfortunate enough to be a taxpayer in Tennessee, you're paying $212,000. Exact same drug, exact same PBM. The price changes depending on how they want to do that and the arbitrage that's in the middle, how they want to move that money around.
I appreciate the answer, especially being here today, given that you're competing industry dominated by the monopoly. So how can Congress disrupt this vertical integration in the industry so that insurance companies can distort our healthcare system and force devastating costs on what I would call vulnerable Oregonians?
I think the vertical consolidation has been 5 years on and is very obviously not helping. Costs continue to go up and quality continues to go down. I think really delinking how PBMs make their profit from a percentage of acquisition cost and sales cost, because then if I'm a PBM and I make 7%, do I want to make 7% off a $5,000 drug or off a $50 drug? And again, these are large corporations who are driven to profit. So, I think it starts with creating the right incentives, getting the right data out there, and then making sure that all of that is completely visible.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Let's move now to the relationship between PBMs and employers. A whole lot of employers have said they're not able to get accurate cost and pricing information, as was stated earlier, from PBMs despite laws which mandate the sharing of this information. PBMs deny this claim and say that employers can receive cost and quality information at any time through the audit. It seems almost coy, really, for certain PBMs to say, if you want to know whether we're following the law, audit us. Knowing small businesses don't have that kind of time, let alone really the resources to do so. So with that disconnect, Mr. Baker, answer me this. How can we bridge this issue so that there is seamless transparency between the PBMs and the employers? And then to follow up to that, Ms. Monahan, what can Congress do to make sure that PBMs comply with the law and meet their reporting requirements, ensuring the disclosure of direct and indirect compensation for their services? I'll wait for those because I'll be running out of time, so make it quick.
And I'll go very quick. I think it goes to the status quo. Basically, PBMs say you can't audit, but then they say only certain auditors can come in and only certain data is available. So the term audit is very loose and it's not as comprehensive as it needs to be, and it should be able to be done by anybody that the employer chooses.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Ms. Monahan.
This committee sent a letter last December encouraging DUL to issue guidance clarifying that the service provider compensation disclosures apply to PBMs and TPAs. And at this point, that guidance hasn't happened, but so further action may be warranted to make sure that's clear.
Great. That was quick. Thank you. Doctor and Ms. Tripoli, but I don't think we're going to have time. If PBMs disappear tomorrow, how do you believe employer health plans would be able to negotiate those drug prices with pharmaceutical companies? I know the answer will be long, so I'll go ahead and ask this question to the chair, submit it, and I appreciate, I just wanted to get that for the record, and with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this important meeting. There have been a lot of exchanges today, and our workforce consistently prioritizes skills over degrees. No other country can compete with us. And apprenticeships play a huge role in maintaining that economic edge. Oregon has created the right environment for maintaining an incredible apprenticeship system, one which other states, frankly, should copy. If you go to the Oregon Apprenticeship and Training Division's website, you'll find easily accessible programs equipping Oregonians to become bricklayers, educators, firefighters, aircraft mechanics, iron workers, and so many more jobs without our state couldn't function, quite frankly. Dr. DeBroy, in your written testimony, you discussed the need to have updated and accessible databases so that apprenticeship programs are meeting the labor's market needs. Can you tell me what are the barriers preventing these kinds of databases?
Thank you so much for the question, and it's such an important one. I want to grab my notes on this. There's the need that we have right now as a community in workforce to actually better understand the workers, their trajectories, their occupations, their skills, their employment opportunities. I think one of the most critical things we note in the federal data workforce, the federal data infrastructure right now, is that there is a lag in when we get access to that data and how accurate it is in state and regional contexts. And I think investing in the opportunity to actually better understand the American workforce is going to better serve all actors within the workforce ecosystem.
So you're saying the data input is what's the barrier to, the lag of information is what is the barrier? That's the only barrier for the databases?
It is a significant barrier today.
Okay. And what are the targeted solutions we on the committee should focus on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think investments in data infrastructure are actually really critical. And I think through WIOA, we have an opportunity to also start to think about better investments in serving business services as well, to actually better serve small and medium-sized businesses as well as large enterprise and regions.
Thank you. Now for the programs themselves, in terms of how we prepare workers. In Oregon, workers overwhelmingly prefer registered apprenticeships because those programs have clear and uniform standards centered around what is best for the worker. Can you speak to why workers have such a strong preference for registered apprenticeship programs over industry-recognized programs?
Good question. I don't know as much about the variation in apprenticeships. What I will say from the data is that we've seen a proliferation of registered apprenticeships into new occupations in the U.S. labor market. So you named a number of occupations. We've also seen registered apprenticeships in healthcare, in technology, and advanced manufacturing that didn't exist 10 years ago. That's a really promising trend for the American workforce. I think beyond that, though, what we do see is a lot of innovation in employers actually deploying informal apprenticeship models to an additional 200 roles in the U.S. labor market. That's also really important because that's a kind of first step in figuring out how can we build those pathways for workers to actually enter a lot of newer occupations that they haven't historically had access to.
Great, thank you. I would add that it's important to remember that nobody, I hope, wants to get rid of industry-recognized programs, but I think we have to call it like it is. If you want the federal government to financially support your apprenticeship program, you've got to meet the standards which make registered apprenticeships so appealing to the workers. So really one last question that I have for you, Dr. DeBroy. Aside from the things you've already mentioned, what are the best ways Congress can make apprenticeships more successful for workers? And please feel free to take really what's left of 56 seconds to answer the question.
I do think it starts with a better data infrastructure for the American workforce. And then beyond that, I do think that there's apprenticeships still account for a really small portion of how workers get access to jobs. We need to scale that in a significant way, and there are ways that we can actually incentivize employers to move towards skills-based hiring practices, and apprenticeships are just one method, right? There are other methods like helping them see that internships are a pathway into work that contract to hire opportunities are also another way to bring workers who haven't historically had access to a number of opportunities into their jobs as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeBroy. Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to offer an amendment in the nature of the substitute for the Health Data Act, or H.R. 4527, which amends the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, ERISA, to ensure employers are not contractually restricted from obtaining costs or quality of care information about their own health care plans. Since the enactment of the bipartisan No Surprises Act in 2020, the executive branch has attempted to provide regulatory guidance for the law's implementation. The issue at hand today is that Section 724, the gag clause prohibition, needs to be strengthened. The gag clause prohibition is meant to ensure employers aren't prevented by PBMs or third-party administrators from receiving important healthcare data they're entitled to see. This data allows employers to see why costs are what they are, and this access will ensure that employers are able to meet their duty to provide workers with the best plan. Employers shouldn't be barred by armies of corporate lawyers from knowing the cost of information of their own plans. The Health Data Act is an effort to close the loopholes in current law and increase transparency in the system. Service providers are circumventing current law by limiting the number of claims an employer can audit, limiting the number of audits an employer can conduct, demanding the audit be conducted by their own company, and hiding indirect compensation received by the service provider for its role administering a plan, and demanding that the audit take place on the service provider's premises. Also, the incentives of Section 724 are misaligned. As written, it restricts the health plan issuer from agreeing to a gag clause instead of the intended service providers and third-party administrators. Finally, although the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have created a website for gag clause attestation, it has wrongly allowed service providers to attest on behalf of health plan issuers. Talk about a conflict of interest. This bill fixes an underlying bipartisan agreement, and I believe that the spirit of that agreement still stands. For those reasons, I look forward to voting for the Health Data Act. I also want to thank the Education Workforce Committee staff who have worked so hard on this bill and the incredible overall package we're voting on today, especially Taylor, Seth, CJ, Mindy, and John. With that, I yield back. And
thank you. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Chavez-DeRemer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Over the course of my life, I cannot think of a more terrifying time for the Jewish community. Hamas, a terrorist organization which violently oppresses and sacrifices Palestinians in Gaza, carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And immediately, university students and administrations proudly took up the banner of Hamas. The sole interest of Hamas in using Palestinians as collateral damage in their extremist aim to kill every last Jew remaining in the world. And yet so many students and universities didn't hesitate to make it clear that being Jewish is justified cause for harassment, assault, death threats, and murder. The question has to be asked, why is anti-Semitism such a shared sickness in American universities? For many elite institutions, Jewish students were prohibited from attending for a significant period of their existence. And if American history has taught us anything, it's that ingrained racism is something you have to force out of institutions. It doesn't disappear on its own. Mr. Marcus, are you able to further provide the committee the historical context of anti-Semitism in American universities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I agree entirely with your remarks. Speaking as a practitioner as opposed to a historian, I can tell you that 20 years ago when I first dealt with this issue, we had faced a half-century of progress, ending roughly with the onset of the Second Intifada. But over these last 2 decades, the situation has turned around, getting worse over 20 years, but with accelerating deterioration during the last several years, with a particular spike since October 7, with college campuses, places where you would expect toleration, providing exactly the opposite of that.
Ms. Tartak, thank you for being here, being so brave. In your view, at Yale and other universities, how has the systemic anti-Semitism been able to maintain itself in this modern era?
Thank you for the question. So The sense that I've gotten from university administrations and the reason why they seem to really be failing to handle this issue is because somehow it has been successfully politicized. To be more specific, so that administrations and I would say, pro-Hamas students and faculty view any condemnation as anti-Semitism somehow as another form of bigotry against Muslims or Palestinians, which is why we wind up with statement after statement of both sidesism when a Jewish student is harassed or assaulted. This happened at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. A student was beaten up. A Jewish student was beaten up while holding an Israeli flag. They then came back and took a knife and destroyed the flag. And then the university's statement said, we condemn anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and maybe they also said all other forms of bigotry. This is just, it's pure evidence. They cannot condemn anti-Semitism by itself. And so that's a really good way of erasing anti-Semitism when it happens.
Thank you. You being here gives me, and I imagine everyone here, a lot of hope. The past dictates the present, and it seems clear that universities have not seriously reckoned with how historic anti-Semitism has arguably gotten stronger in the modern era of academia. As an American, I pray that there can be a resolution to this hatred. As a member of Congress, I remain determined to continue working to ensure the existence of Jewish people is protected. No person should ever fear for their safety on account of their race, color, or creed. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this unfortunately necessary hearing. President Gay, McGill, Kornbluth, while I appreciate your testimony, I am a bit confused. In each of your testimonies, you address anti-Semitism on your campuses in the present and future tense, as if there's no underlying cause predating October 7th, which explains why many of your students were at the ready to harass, threaten, and attack Jewish students. Are we really to believe that anti-Semitism didn't exist on your campuses before the Hamas attack? As presidents of the universities, your jobs don't stop at fundraising and promoting academic success. The cultures of your campuses have no greater influence than you and what you choose to prioritize. And at an educational institution, the most powerful mover of culture is the education itself. The opportunities to learn about people's history provide students the best chance to challenge preconceptions, biases, and inspire curiosity to understand rather than villainize. At each of your schools, there are numerous classes focused on Latino, Black, Indigenous, and AAPI history. The existence of such classes is necessary, speaks to your commitment to these communities, the commitment to the amplification of those voices. Minority groups need their voices at the table. The Jewish people make up 2.4% of America's population and are only 0.2% of the global population. For the past 5,000 years, they have been enslaved, lynched, and systematically murdered. During that same time, they have relentlessly improved the course of humanity, selflessly contributing to societies which eventually betrayed them. And yet, President Gay, your university, Harvard, teaches only 2 courses on the history and culture of the Jewish people at the undergrad level. And one of those classes is focused on portraying all Jews who support Israel's existence as colonialist and racist. Compared to the roughly 125 classes Harvard offers on Latino, Black, Indigenous, and AAPI history, the discrepancy feels odd. But you're not alone. President McGill, the University of Pennsylvania, offers 3 classes on Jewish history to undergrads. And President Kornbluth, MIT only offers 2 classes on Jewish history to your undergrad students. This gives the impression that your deans and professors view Jews as an exception, that their voice as a minority group isn't worth amplifying. This near erasure of Jewish history from offered courses is chilling to me. Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania offer its students an incredibly limited opportunity to learn about the 5,000 years of Jewish history. It's no wonder so many of your students see Jews as having less humanity than the rest of us.
in denying the Jewish voice a seat at the table, in denying your student body equitable access to Jewish history, you have created a hostile environment for Jewish students. If you provide your students real opportunities to learn about Jewish history at the same rate as you teach the history of groups, there will be wait lists for those classes. That would provide students the appropriate venue to discuss, debate, and learn. It will inspire your students to have meaningful discussions amongst themselves about the full history of Jewish people. President Gay, McGill, and Kornbluth, you can assemble all the task forces you want and organize countless students' discussions on the issue, but I can assure you that your students, especially your Jewish students, those options come across as lazy and disingenuous. None of you have presented solutions which would address the causes for anti-Semitism at your schools. In your testimonies, I've heard no self-reflection or acknowledgement of failure. President Gay, in your testimony, you said that you're guided by a simple mantra, asking, why not? To the three of you, I encourage you to think of one simple question: why not teach Jewish history? And Madam Chair, I will yield the rest of my time. Pardon me. Thank you. It's true that abortion sometimes is presented as the only choice for unplanned pregnancies, adding to the trapped feeling which hits the moment a young woman's test reads positive when they were praying desperately for negative. The bill we're considering today is about lifting at least some of the weight those women bear, requiring their universities to provide information about resources for carrying a pregnancy to term. Pregnancy is beautiful but grueling, and doing it without a plan or alone adds a sense of defeat more intense than can be put into words. Students having access to resources for their pregnancies isn't just about abortion. It means telling students which obstetricians, gynecologists their insurance covers, or how to navigate things if they're uninsured. It means finding a pediatrician before your child is born for those early visits. It means being shown how to get on wait lists for child care centers. It means information about your degree process or NC2A eligibility if you choose to take time away from school. This amendment being offered by Congressman Good brushes aside those realities and countless others by turning this into something only about abortion. It ignores the full picture. This is about options and support for students not going through the most, This is about options and support for students going through the most unsure moment in their young life. It is not about Congress lecturing women. In its current form, I think this bill has a good shot of becoming law. And should that happen, it will result in countless women never setting foot in an abortion clinic with a newfound confidence to keep their pregnancy and be a mom. I'll be voting no on this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I'm Lori Chavez-DeRemer, new member of Congress representing Oregon. So, Secretary Millar, it's nice to be on the border with you. I am appreciative that you mentioned the I-5 bridge and how important that is as we move through. But my questions today: back in December, the Biden administration, the Council on Environmental Quality, as well as 6 sovereign nations released a final package of commitments in the ongoing Columbia River Systems operation litigation and mediation. In this package, a myriad of provisions were included, and general consensus amongst Pacific Northwest communities and stakeholders in the agreement is a de facto breaching of the dams. My Pacific Northwest colleagues, Congressman Newhouse and Congresswoman McMorris-Rogers, and myself have been staunch supporters of the lower Snake River dams and are deeply concerned about its future. Breaching the dams would be a fatal blow to the Pacific Northwest, as the lower Snake River dams provide immeasurable benefits to the region and the nation. For instance, the river system significantly decreases traffic congestion and pollution. It would take exactly 39,204 rail cars and 150,784 semi-trucks to move the cargo that is barged through the Snake River by rail and truck. So, Mr. Millar, you mentioned in your testimony that the Washington State Department of Transportation works to maintain and improve local roads, railroads, and airports, which is an ongoing issue. Breaching the lower Snake River dams would exacerbate this issue, would it not?
Congresswoman, Washington State in particular, Governor Jay Inslee has not taken a position on breaching the Snake River dams. We are engaged with the other partners in their area on studying the potential impacts of that. We have just begun the study of the transportation impacts and our ability to respond to those impacts. So having just begun the study, I really can't speak to what those impacts might be.
By adding a substantial amount of rail cars and trucks to railroads and highways, would your agency still be able to meet its objectives?
Yes.
The lower Snake River dams play a significant role in not only providing clean, renewable hydropower energy, which provides my constituents with low-cost electricity, but also transporting approximately 60% of the nation's wheat exports. Mr. Millar, if the lower Snake River dams were breached, how would this wheat alternatively be transported?
Again, no decision's been made, and the state of Washington has taken no position in that space. The options that shippers have to barging would be by rail or by truck.
If an alternative plan could not imminently be implemented, don't you think this would further negatively impact supply chain issues that would already exacerbated by COVID-19? My guess is you're going to say the study is still out there, so no decision's been made. But I would like to keep an eye on it and work with your office and make sure that we're paying attention to how this happens.
The state of Washington is partnering with other entities that are interested and involved in that particular issue, including the state of Oregon. We welcome the continued communication.
Well, I appreciate the support for the Pacific Northwest, and I'm glad that you're here today. Thanks. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Carbajal. Recognize the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Chavez-DeRemer.
Thank you, Chairman. Nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you. Thanks.
I represent Oregon's 5th Congressional District, and I'm grateful to be on this committee to ask these questions. So I'll get right started. Long delays and cancellations have become too common in airports, in large part due to the shortage of pilots. It would be ridiculous for us to look at the current state of things and say, everything is fine. Let's just keep the status quo. Last week, through my work on Education and Workforce Committee, the Flight Education Access Act was included in major student loan reform package. This is a huge step in resolving that shortage. The common sense proposal closes the pilot workforce gap by letting prospective pilots access the same loan opportunities available to students at traditional four-year schools. It increases the total maximum amount of the federal direct and subsidized Stafford loans an eligible dependent may borrow to $11,000, increases the maximum amount for independent students to $137,500, and increases the maximum amount of federal direct Stafford loans to a total of $65,000. Mr. Administrator, if prospective pilots could access these types of student loans and use them when completing the FAA's regulated training, would that help improve the pilot shortage?
I think that would be a very useful initiative. It is very expensive to become an airline pilot, which means 1,500 hours. So you can become a private pilot with as few as 40 hours. So getting from 40 to 1,500 is a hugely expensive endeavor. So it's like any other profession, doctor, lawyer, plumber. It costs money to get there, and so
you would agree it's a positive outcome.
Absolutely.
This would be a positive initiative to
Absolutely.
move forward. So moving on, what should be the most common part of air travel safety? Of course, you've heard plenty about the Boeing Alaska accident today, and amongst others, but it is not lost on me is that it happened in Oregon, my home state. Oregonians, we choose Alaska Airlines as their preferred airline, and I fly on them every single week, back and forth. Boeing jets rightfully have cause for concern and many questions. Can you speak to the level of confidence, once again today, in the FAA-approved inspection steps for the 737-9 MAX door plug?
Yes, I think that was a very thorough inspection process, and the mechanical fix to that defect, we have a high level of confidence that takes care of the problem.
And so you'd fly on the 737-9 MAX?
Yes, I would.
Congressman Carbajal kind of talked on my last question on the contract tower program, and I have one of those in my district in Bend. So I appreciate you answering that you are in full support of continuing that. So I will yield my time then to my colleague, Mr. Nels, the remaining time.